At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Richard Roberts is Industry Affairs Manager for Honeywell Fire Safety. Richard, take it away.
All right, thank you, David. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their very busy schedules to attend today's informative presentation. Now, I realize most people would rather watch paint dry or chew glass than have a discussion about codes. However, every professional involved in the fire alarm industry needs to have a basic understanding of the codes because the codes drive our business. A building or fire code specifies when and what type of a fire alarm or carbon monoxide detection system is to be installed in a particular type of occupancy. Now, the good news is there are new requirements in the 2012 and the 2015 codes that will save lives and reduce injuries. During the next 60 minutes, we'll take a look at how many states have adopted the 2012 edition of the I codes, which have, as I mentioned, several noteworthy changes that will enhance public life safety. Then we'll switch gears and begin reviewing several of the key changes to the 2012 edition of the International Fire Code, Building Code, as well as looking at some of the changes to the 2012 edition of NFPA 101, 5000, and NFPA 1. Lastly, we'll finish the webinar up by looking at some of the key changes to the recently published 2015 edition of the ICC and NFPA codes. So as I said, I'd like to start the webinar off by looking at how many states have adopted the 2012 edition of the IBC or the IBC. And to the best of my knowledge, the 15 states colored in blue on the screen have adopted the 2012 I codes. Now that means there are 35 states that are enforcing older versions of the code. And these older versions of the code do not require an emergency voice alarm communication system to be installed in newly constructed K-12 schools. They don't require CO detection in newly constructed hotels, apartment buildings, dormitories, and certain healthcare occupancies. Also, automatic smoke detection is not required in the common spaces outside of dormitory sleeping rooms. And lastly, they do not require the low-frequency audible fire alarm signal to be installed in all sleeping areas, and this is intended to improve the waking effectiveness of high-risk segments of the population in hotels, dormitory, or apartment buildings. Now, the takeaway of this slide is that newer editions of the I codes improve public life safety as well as increasing the demand for our products and services. All right, let's start reviewing the actual changes, which will impact your future fire alarm installations. I'd like to point out, though, that we don't have enough time to cover all the details, requirements, or exceptions. Therefore, I highly recommend purchasing a copy of the ICC or NFPA codes that we'll cover today, or better yet, a copy of the handbook for all the requirements and details relating to fire alarm or carbon monoxide installations. So let's get started by reviewing the changes to the 2012 edition of the International Fire Code and International Building Code. The first change that we'll look at will increase the safety for students and faculty in K-12 schools. Now, tragically, in recent years, we've all seen an increase in acts of violence committed against students and staff. For the 2012 code, fire alarm systems installed in newly constructed schools are now required to use an emergency voice alarm communication system for occupant notification instead of using horns. A voice system is only required when the occupant load exceeds 30 people. Using an EVAC system for occupant notification has several very important benefits over horns. First, it's able to provide pre-recorded or live voice instructions throughout the school during emergencies, whereas horns are only capable of providing an audible tone. An EVAC system will reduce installation costs by eliminating the need for a separate public address system, and that's because an EVAC system can be used for general paging, daily classroom changes, severe weather alerts, and yes, acts of violence. Lastly, public address systems do not have a secondary power supply, and they typically do not supervise the circuit wiring. Whereas an emergency voice alarm communication system, they are required to have a secondary power supply, and they supervise all critical system functions for opens, shorts, and grounds. All right, this change is intended to protect people from dangerous levels of carbon monoxide gas. According to the CDC, more than 300 people die every year in the U.S. from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, and over 20,000 people are injured. Also, in recent years, there have been numerous fatalities that have occurred from CO poisoning in hotels. And one of the most effective ways to reduce the occurrence of CO poisoning is to ensure that CO detection devices are installed in places where people live, work, sleep, and study. For the 2012 International Fire Code and International Building Code, CO detection is now required in sleeping rooms of newly constructed hotels, apartment buildings, dormitories, nursing homes, hospitals, prisons, and jails that have a permanently installed fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage. An open parking garage, as defined by the building code, or an enclosed parking garage that's ventilated in accordance with the mechanical code is not deemed to be an attached garage. The new IFC IBC requirements are pretty consistent with the requirements that were added to the 2009 edition of the International Residential Code, which added requirements for CO detection to be installed in newly constructed 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhomes not more than 3 stories. As with all codes and standards, there are exceptions to the mandatory requirements, and the CO requirements that we just discussed, they have a few exceptions. And these exceptions are based on, for example, is it really necessary to install CO detectors in every guest room of a 10-story hotel when the only fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage is located on the first floor or basement? The answer may be no if the upper floors are not connected by ductwork or ventilation shafts to the room containing a fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage that's located in the basement or on the first floor. The CO exceptions in the 2012 code are as follows. If a sleeping unit or dwelling unit has no fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage, but they're located in a building with a fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage, CO detection is not required in the sleeping unit or dwelling unit if the sleeping unit is located more than 1 story above or 1 story below any story which contains a fuel-burning appliance or has an attached garage. Second, if the sleeping unit or dwelling unit is not connected by ductwork or ventilation shafts to any room containing a fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage. And lastly, if the building is provided with a common area CO alarm system. Now, I should mention that the term common area CO alarm system is very vague, unenforceable, and it's undefined in the I codes, or for that matter, NFPA 720. Fortunately, a change was made to the 2015 edition of these codes, and it provides more clear and probably more enforceable language. And I'll explain this change in a few slides. This change is intended to protect students in dormitories. According to a 2011 NFPA report, U.S. fire departments responded to an estimated annual average of 3,840 structure fires in dormitories, fraternities, sororities between 2005 and 2009. And these fires caused an annual average of 3 student fatalities and 38 injuries. So to reduce property damage and casualties, the 2012 code now requires an automatic smoke detection system to be installed in, number 1, the common spaces outside of the dwelling unit, sleeping unit of college and university buildings. Second, in laundry rooms, mechanical equipment rooms, and storage rooms. And lastly, in all interior corridors serving sleeping units or dwelling units. Now, smoke detectors are not required in college and university buildings, provided that there are no interior corridors serving sleeping units or dwelling units. In other words, if the corridor is exposed to the outside, it's not an interior corridor. Second, the sleeping unit or dwelling unit has a means of egress door that opens directly to a room or space that leads directly to an exit, or the sleeping unit or dwelling unit has a means of egress door opening directly to an exit. One of the hottest topics in the industry today is about the new low-frequency audible fire alarm requirements in the 2010 edition of NFPA 72. The reason for this new requirement is numerous studies have concluded that the low-frequency audible fire alarm signal is most effective for waking up people who are hard of hearing, school-aged children, the elderly, and yes, people who are alcohol impaired. Based on this new research, low-frequency requirements were added to Chapter 18 of the 2010 of NFPA 72, which is adopted through reference in the International Fire Code and International Building Code. And looking at the IFC IBC, Section 907.2 requires all fire alarm systems to be installed in accordance with NFPA 72 and to provide occupant notification in accordance with Section 907.5 of the IFC IBC. And looking at Section 907.5, it requires the activation of a fire alarm initiating device to send a signal to the control unit and then provide occupant notification throughout all occupied areas of the building, including common spaces and tenant spaces. Now, several examples of common spaces are corridors, lobbies, or meeting rooms. And several examples of tenant spaces are dwelling units within apartment buildings, guest rooms of hotels, or dormitory sleeping rooms. So the basic purpose of a fire alarm system is to alert all occupants in a building. The 2010 edition of NFPA 72 is referenced in Chapter 80 of the IFC, and it's referenced in Chapter 35 of the IBC. And looking at NFPA 72, Section 18453 requires the low-frequency audible fire alarm signal in all occupancies having a protected premise fire alarm system to wake up people who are sleeping. Several examples of where this low-frequency signal is required to be installed are in hotel guest rooms, dormitory sleeping rooms, and dwelling unit bedrooms within apartment buildings. All right, David, it looks like we're ready for our first poll question.
All right. Thank you, Richard. So this would be a time we're going to call your attention to the screen here. So we're just curious, which code has your state or jurisdiction adopted? Are you currently on the 2012 IFC IBC or NFPA 101 or the 2015 version of the same, or is it other? And we're going to display those results, so come in and vote. and you will see we have a large group here, almost 1,000 people with us today. So you'll see a good cross-section of the population on what codes they are on. Hey, Richard, is it okay? We've got some questions posted here from the audience. Can I ask you those while they're voting for us?
Sure.
Okay. So the first one is they're talking about the low frequency area. In fact, both questions here. The first two came in. Will we be required to verify the 520 hertz square wave tone during our inspection process?
Yeah, good question. And actually, as I said, it's one of the hottest topic in the fire alarm industry today. So I'm not surprised that we already have some questions about low frequency. To answer the question, there is no field test to verify that the horn or sounder produces the low frequency audible fire alarm signal. Proof of compliance can be verified by reviewing the product nameplate and reading that it meets the UL 464 requirements for low frequency application. I should also point out that UL 464 requires all products that are listed for low frequency application to have the words low frequency alarm or low frequency sounder on the exterior of the housing of the unit. So whether you're someone inspecting the fire alarm industry or installing it, look for that wording on the outside of the sounder.
Okay. All right. One more question here, and we'll get back to your presentation. But are low-frequency sounders also required in hallways of the sleeping areas?
Another excellent question. Short answer is no. The intent is for the low-frequency signal to be installed only in sleeping units, and that is to wake up people who are sleeping, obviously. However, the code does not prohibit the installation of low-frequency sounders in locations outside of the sleeping unit or throughout the building.
Okay, and we recognize there's a number of other questions posted here. We'll get to those many of them at the next break. So back to you, Richard. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. Now let's take a few minutes to review several of the key changes to the 2012 edition of NFPA 101, 5000, and NFPA 1. Now, even though these NFPA codes are not as widely adopted throughout the U.S. as the I codes, a few states do adopt them, and the NFPA codes are frequently adopted outside of the U.S. For example, I know that Florida and Georgia use NFPA 101 as the basis for their fire prevention code, and Massachusetts has adopted NFPA 1. All right, many of the changes to the 2012 NFPA codes are essentially the same as the changes we just reviewed for the I codes. For example, this first change, CO detection is now required outside of sleeping units in 1- and 2-family dwellings, rooming houses, hotels, dormitories, and apartment buildings. CO detection is only required in these occupancies when they contain a permanently installed fuel-burning appliance or when they have a communicating attached garage. An open parking garage, as defined by the building code, or an enclosed parking garage that's ventilated in accordance with the mechanical code shall not be deemed as an attached garage. In addition to the sleeping area requirements that we just looked at, CO alarms or detectors are required to be installed in the following non-sleeping locations in hotels, dormitories, and apartment buildings. First, on the ceiling in rooms containing a permanently installed fuel-burning appliance. And the second requirement is for CO detection to be installed centrally located within occupiable spaces served by the first air register from a fuel-burning HVAC system. All right, now that we've reviewed the 2012 codes, let's switch gears and review several of the key changes to the 2015 edition of the I codes. first change that we'll look at increases the trigger for installing an EVAC system in K through 12 schools from an occupant load of 30 or more, which was in the 2012 code, to 100 or more in the 2015 code. The intent of this change is to exempt smaller schools from having to incur the added cost of installing an EVAC system. Now, on the surface, this kind of appears to be a loss for the safety of students and faculty, but it's actually a win. That's because there were two other proposals submitted to increase the trigger to 1,000 or 1,000, or to 500 or 1,000 occupants. Fortunately, these two proposals were defeated. This change was initiated by the International Code Council's Healthcare Committee, and it permits the elimination of both the audible and visible alarm signal in healthcare critical care areas, such as hospital operating rooms. In the past, the code only permitted the audible notification appliance to be eliminated. Now, it goes without saying, having a strobe light installed in an operating room could be very distracting for the surgeon, but it could be dangerous or even life-threatening for the patient. Now, for the 2015 code, both horns and strobes are permitted, not required, but it is permitted to be eliminated if private mode signaling is provided in accordance with the IBC Fire Safety Plan and NFPA 72. Of course, private mode signaling relies on trained staff that's on duty 24/7, 365 days a year to wake up patients or move them to a safe place in the event of a fire. This change was also submitted by the ICC Healthcare Committee, and it increases the hospital smoke compartment size from 22,500 square feet to not more than 40,000 square feet. Now, this change, however, has created a conflict with NFPA 101, which still requires the smoke compartment size to not exceed 22,500 square feet. It's important to point out that hospitals need to comply with both the IBC and NFPA 101. Let me explain. Typically, hospitals are required by the state or local municipality to comply with the IBC for the actual construction of the building. But once the hospital is open, it must comply with NFPA 101 in order to receive federal Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. The new requirements may impact the number of addressable modules used to monitor and control smoke dampers. Now, the healthcare community really wanted this change to keep up with changing patient care needs. For example, today there are fewer patients per smoke compartment, and that's because the size of patient rooms have increased quite a bit over the last few years due to more equipment being used for patient care. Also, the trend in hospitals is moving away from 2 beds per room to a single bed patient room, and this is needed to reduce the occurrence of infections. All right, David, we're ready for another poll question.
All right, thank you. And we do have a bunch of people that have posted questions, so please don't be frustrated with us if we don't get to your question in the near term. We're going to answer a couple here with each poll question stop. So the next poll question is, are you involved in any of the following projects? So check all that apply. And we realize that this is a very short list, but we've just covered some hospital and educational information, and we're just curious, as a quick survey of our attendees here, if you are involved in that hospital or healthcare arena. Maybe you're involved in K through 12 schools or even college and universities, or if you're not, simply click none of the above, and that's an appropriate response as well. So Richard, a couple questions here. We'll just take them as they've come in. Are the requirements in the IFB and IBC retroactive?
Good question. If you look at Chapter 907.2, which is where most of the changes that we've discussed today, they do not apply retroactively to existing systems. However, there are situations when an AHJ may require an existing system needs to be brought up to current code, even though the system still meets the minimum requirements of the version of the code that was in effect during the original installation. Several examples might be changes made to an existing system, such as replacing a portion or all of the components of a system. Another example may be that the AHJ may determine that an existing system may present a hazard to life or property. If you look at Chapter 1103 of the IFC, it does apply to the existing requirements for existing systems. So, that's why we always say it's really important to consult with the local AHJ before bidding on any existing project.
All right, very good. So we'll leave the poll question open just for a couple seconds more here. One more question to ask, Richard. Under the CO detection requirements, an attendee asks, what is a communications garage?
Probably mean a communicating garage. It's an excellent question. The term communicating a garage is undefined in the NFPA code or explained in the annex. The committee's intended definition of communicating is a garage with a door or entryway between the garage and the occupied areas of the building. Many people on the committee believed and are of the opinion that CO gas was unable to diffuse through solid wall, ceiling, and floor assemblies. But I should mention there is an ongoing Fire Protection Research Foundation project that seeks to determine if CO gas is capable of diffusing through wall, ceiling, or floor assemblies. This FPR project is scheduled to be completed by the end of next month, and the preliminary data gathered seems to suggest that CO gas is capable of diffusing through wall, ceiling, or floor assemblies.
Okay, all right, very good. So let me close this poll. Thank you for voting. We all but about 100 of you voted. So, and I know some of you are sitting in conference rooms where maybe only one person can vote. So we do appreciate your participation in the poll questions. And Richard, back to you.
All right, thanks, David. This change was submitted by the ICC Fire Code Action Committee, and it replaces the traditional fire alarm system zone requirement with a point identification requirement. Now, in the past, the code required each floor of a building to constitute one fire alarm zone, and additional fire alarm zones were required if the floor area exceeded 22,500 square feet. The 2015 code now requires all fire alarm systems to identify the specific type of initiating device, its address, location, and floor level, as well as indicating whether that initiating device is in alarm, trouble, or supervisory condition. The intent of this change is to help emergency first responders to quickly identify the exact location of an activated initiating device during an emergency or a fire situation. And secondly, to help reduce nuisance alarms by pinpointing the exact location of a problematic initiating device. However, smaller fire alarm systems are exempted from this point identification requirement if the building is less than 22,500 square feet or if the system only has manual pull stations or water flow switches. Now, even though the text in the code does not use the word addressable or addressable fire alarm system, this new requirement, when adopted, should result in more addressable fire alarm systems being installed. All right, now let's review some changes to the IFC, IBC, and IRC, that's the International Residential Code, that relate to smoke detection. These changes seek to reduce the occurrence of frequent false alarms from normal cooking activities and steam from bathrooms. looking at Section 907-211.3 of the IFC IBC, and Section R314.3.1 of the IRC, new requirements were added for the specific placement of smoke alarms or smoke detectors in close proximity to fixed cooking appliances. And the second sections there, that would be Section 907-211 of the IFC IBC and Section R314.3.4 of the IRC, have new requirements for the specific placement of smoke detection devices in close proximity to bathrooms. Now, these new requirements in the I codes are very similar and are based on the new requirements that were added to the 2010 edition of NFPA 72. All right, I'd like to use this illustration to help explain the new requirements. Smoke alarms or smoke detectors are prohibited from being installed less than 10 feet from a fixed cooking appliance. This 10-foot area of exclusion is the shaded gray area. Now, for smoke detection that's installed between 10 feet and 20 feet from a fixed cooking appliance, it requires the device to be equipped with an alarm silencing means or use photoelectric technology. The smoke alarm or the smoke detector is the red dot on the screen. Now, even though the requirement does not specifically call out ionization technology, ionization alarms or detectors are only permitted to be installed between 10 and 20 feet from a fixed cooking appliance if they have an alarm silencing means, or more commonly referred to as a hush button. Now, the new requirement also prohibits smoke alarms or smoke detectors from being installed less than 3 feet from a door leading to a bathroom that contains a bathtub or shower. And you can see the bathtub or the bathroom is located on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, there is an exception to the 10-foot area of exclusion that we just discussed, and that's because in many very small living spaces it may not be possible to place a smoke alarm or detector greater than 10 feet from a fixed cooking appliance. For this type of an application, for example, the code requires a smoke detection device to be installed inside each bedroom and outside of each bedroom. However, if the door to the bedroom is less than 10 feet from a fixed cooking appliance, then it's not possible to maintain that 10-foot area of exclusion that we discussed in the previous slide. And for these applications, the code permits a photoelectric alarm only or detector to be installed up to 6 feet from a fixed cooking appliance. Now, the new requirements in the I codes and NFPA were driven by concern about nuisance alarms. And here are a few facts that I think you'll find interesting, and these facts were used as the basis for the new requirements in the I codes and NFPA 72. So, nuisance alarms are the leading cause of occupants disabling their smoke alarms, and roughly 20% of all smoke alarms installed in U.S. homes have been disabled. The 20% number is most likely higher in high-risk areas such as inner cities and rural communities. Now, cooking activities like pan frying, baking, and sauteing are the leading cause of nuisance alarms. Now, both ionization and photoelectric technology are both subject to nuisance alarms from normal cooking activities, but ionization technology is more likely to generate nuisance alarms than photoelectric when they're installed too close to a fixed cooking appliance. That's the reason for these new requirements, and that's why proper installation is critical to minimizing nuisance alarms. This change permits system-connected smoke detectors to be installed in lieu of smoke alarms in hotel guest rooms, dormitory sleeping rooms, and in dwelling units within apartment buildings. The new provision requires the smoke detector to initiate an audible alarm signal in these locations that we just mentioned, but prohibits the alarm signal from being transmitted beyond these locations. Now, this change was needed because in the past the code required smoke alarms only, not detectors, to be installed in hotel guest rooms, dormitory sleeping rooms, and in dwelling units within apartment buildings. And many code officials over the years would take this requirement literally and prohibit system-connected smoke detectors from being installed in these locations, even though they provide better reliability and performance. All right, there are several changes that deal with carbon monoxide detection. First, the CO requirements were relocated from Section 908.7 in the 2012 code to Section 915 in the 2015 code. And this change was needed because the scope of Section 908 covers alarm systems intended to detect combustible and flammable materials. CO gas is toxic. Matter of fact, it's very toxic, but it's not flammable or combustible. So it made sense to create a standalone section for CO detection that's installed in hotels, apartment buildings, dormitories, certain healthcare facilities, and schools. The next change was submitted by the Utah chapter of the ICC, and it expands the CO requirements beyond hotels, apartment buildings, and dormitories to include K through 12 schools only when the schools contain a fuel-burning appliance or an attached garage. This proposal was in response to Connecticut, Maryland, and California signing bills into law requiring CO detection in K through 12 schools after several really high-profile incidents that really garnered a lot of national publicity. And each of these states had varying degrees or different installation requirements. So the code officials really felt that we need consistent requirements for installation of CO detection in K through 12 schools throughout the country, and installation needs to be left up to the code writers as opposed to our illustrious politicians. The third change adds prescriptive requirements for the term Common Area CO Alarm System. This change was needed because the term Common Area CO Alarm System, as I explained a few slides ago in the 2012 code, is vague, unenforceable, and undefined in the I codes or NFPA 720. For the 2015 code, CO detection is required inside each dwelling unit, sleeping unit, or in a classroom that contains a fuel-burning appliance. However, if that fuel-burning appliance is located outside of a dwelling unit, sleeping unit, or classroom, then CO detection is required to be installed on the ceiling in a room containing the fuel-burning appliance or in an approved location between the room that has the fuel-burning appliance and the dwelling unit, sleeping unit, or classroom. And lastly, hospitals, nursing homes, prisons, and jails were removed from the list of occupancies that's required to install CO detection. This change was made because many people are of the opinion that CO detection is not warranted in these occupancies because there is trained staff on duty 24/7, 365 days a year to take appropriate action if there is a CO leak or if people begin to get sick from the CO. This change is an interesting one, and it will certainly enhance public life safety. Chapter 5307 is new, and it's intended to protect people in restaurants from carbon dioxide leaks from beverage storage tanks. A carbon dioxide or CO2 leak will displace the oxygen in the room or area where the beverage tanks are, and it may cause people to die from asphyxiation. Chapter 5307 requires either a mechanical ventilation system, or an emergency alarm system to be installed in rooms containing beverage dispensing equipment with more than 100 pounds of CO2. When the alarm system option is selected, a gas detection system with CO detectors are required to be installed in the room that contains the beverage dispensing tanks. This is another change relating to gas detection, and it will certainly help promote energy efficiency as well as providing optimum life safety protection for building occupants. The change was made to Section 404.1 of the International Mechanical Code, and it removed motion detectors as a permissible option to operating the mechanical ventilation fans in enclosed parking structures. Now this change leaves only carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide as the only permissible option to continuously operating the mechanical ventilation fans. These two changes delete the requirement for a household fire alarm or carbon monoxide detection system to be monitored by a remote supervising station. Section R3147 relates to household fire alarm systems, and Section R315.6 relates to household CO detection systems. This change was made because many people are of the opinion that monitoring a household fire or CO system is not warranted because there is no such requirement for automatic sprinklers. All right, now let's start looking at some of the key changes to the 2015 edition of NFPA 101, 5000, or NFPA 1. Many of the changes to the 2015 NFPA codes are essentially the same changes we just reviewed for the 2015 I codes. For example, Section 96210.4 and Section 96210.5 have specific requirements for the placement of smoke detection devices installed in close proximity to fixed cooking appliances and bathrooms. Of course, the intent here is to reduce frequent unwanted alarms in occupancies such as hotels, dormitories, and boarding houses, assisted living facilities, and 1- and 2-family dwellings. The actual placement requirements are pretty close, if not identical, to the changes that we just reviewed a few slides ago in the IFC, IBC, and IRC. So I'm not going to review in detail those requirements. Section 96210.2 is also new, and it prohibits smoke alarms from being installed as a substitute for where the code requires system-connected smoke detectors to be installed. The intent is to prohibit installers or designers from installing a less expensive type of smoke detection device. These two changes relate to education occupancies. The first change requires an emergency voice alarm communication system to be used for fire alarm evacuation and notification and other signaling purposes. As we discussed a few slides ago, a voice system has several benefits over horns. It's able to provide pre-recorded or live voice instructions throughout the school during emergencies, whereas horns are only capable of providing an audible tone. A voice system is capable of being used for signaling other than fire emergencies, such as general paging, daily classroom changes, severe weather alerts, and acts of violence. A voice system will reduce the installation cost by eliminating the need for a separate public address system. The second change, that would be to the second change requires K through 12 schools and daycare occupancies to install carbon monoxide detection. Now, this is an interesting change, and it was submitted by the NFPA High-Rise Building Safety Committee. It doesn't necessarily apply to fire alarm systems. It's more security related, but I think that probably many people on the call today or the webinar today, they do security work. And this change seeks to help emergency first responders to monitor and manage occupant egress during an emergency in high-rise buildings. The change requires exit stairwells to be equipped with video cameras that will provide real-time images for the fire service to observe. The video cameras are only required in newly constructed high-rise buildings with an occupant load of over 4,000 people. All right, David, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows.
You bet, Richard. Thank you for that. And let me put up our last poll question. It's not really a poll question, but it's how we can help you. So System Sensor has a number of resources available that you may want to take advantage of. If any of those look like something you would like, we'd like to send them to you at no charge. So a number of them are applications guides. These are longer form, detailed information on, as you see there, voice EVAC or CO detection or low frequency, the newer requirement Richard talked about. We also have an intelligibility link to AV devices white paper, and we have a low frequency FAQ. And then some of you may be saying, I'd like to talk to someone at System Sensor about products or some of the topics brought up today. Click that Please Contact Me link, and we'll reach out to you. We do have a ton of questions here, so my apologies in advance if we don't get to yours specifically, but we will work through as many as we can, as Richard said, in the hour reserved for this webinar. So Richard, one of the attendees is saying they have a bunch of old ion smoke detectors. Are there special disposal requirements for ion detectors? So a little bit off of the code requirement here, but what is the disposal requirements for ion detectors?
Well, it's really a good question because, as we know, ion detectors have a small amount of radioactive material in them, and this small amount of radioactive material is, very, very safe. But all smoke detection manufacturers have a process for disposal or return of ion alarms or detectors. So you should contact the manufacturer of the actual ion detector.
Okay, all right. I bet we've had 30 or 40 people ask a question, and I'm going to answer it because I can. They're asking for a copy or an archive of this presentation. We will be sending you a link to the webinar archive, so you'll have both the audio and the visual together, and that will be back to you before end of day. So the other question that's come up is about the CEU certificates, and those will also be sent to you before end of day. I would ask, if you don't have them by end of day, check both your inbox and maybe your junk folder. We found that some of them do float into a junk folder because we're obviously emailing out to 800 or 900 people here, and sometimes the search engines or the email engines don't like that. So anyway, so presentation coming your way and the CEU coming your way before end of day. Richard, next question here. I'm just going to queue them up here. What is the reason for nitrogen dioxide detection in enclosed parking garages?
That's a good question, and it's one that I get quite often. And nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, is a byproduct of diesel engines. And carbon monoxide, that's a byproduct of gasoline engines. So, the enclosed parking garages, they are protected now. Whether you have a vehicle with a gas engine or a diesel engine.
Okay. All right. Very good. So let's get to other questions here, and I'm just going to rip through these. Some of them were posted early on, so it might reference data that you covered maybe 20 or 30 minutes ago. So first one, is it the intent of the ICC to adopt all of NFPA 72 in Chapter 9, or just the reference sections in 72 that may mention or indicate Chapter 35 of the IBC? I can reread that if you want.
Yeah, it's. I think I understand the question, and it's the intent of the International Fire Code, Building Code, or Residential Code to adopt all requirements in NFPA 72.
Okay. All right. And we're going to jump around here.
I was just using that, that one requirement for low frequency signals as an example. So that's why I just called out a specific section of NFPA 72.
Okay, very good. So just a reminder, there is a poll question posted if there's any way we can help you. We'll leave it up there for another couple minutes, but we will be taking it down here shortly. Just going to jump around here, Richard, because there's some questions that are very similar. Is low frequency notification required in healthcare occupancies, specifically within on-call physician sleep rooms?
That's a very good question. As a rule, low-frequency sounders are not required in healthcare occupancies that have trained staff on duty 24/7, 365 days a year, because this trained staff, it's their responsibility to wake up people or relocate them to a safe place in the event of a fire. Now, in terms of the physician or nursing sleeping rooms, the code is really, I would say, silent on that. But certainly, as an installer or a designer, I would want to install the low-frequency signal in that room, because, not only is the low-frequency signal better at waking up high-risk segments of the population, such as people with hearing loss, the elderly, school-aged children, and the alcohol-impaired, but it's even better at waking up normal, healthy adults. So I would want to make sure that if there's a fire and you have a nurse or a physician sleeping, that it will wake them up quickly.
Okay, very good. So let's move on here. You were talking about CO detection, and can a CO detector, or does a CO detector have to be connected to the fire alarm system, or can it be just on building power and not connected to the fire alarm system?
The requirements in the I codes and NFPA codes, it leaves it up to the designer, installer, or building owner. They say, they typically require alarms to be installed, but they permit system-connected CO detectors to be installed.
Okay. And we should also point out, folks, kind of quickly point out that a number of you have said, well, that doesn't work with my AHJ. So at the end of the day, please refer to your AHJ for local interpretation of that as well.
Absolutely. Good point.
Yep. So attendees asking about what's the definition. You referenced corridor in your presentation. What's the definition of a corridor?
Off the top of my head, and don't hold me to that, but that's a passageway in a building that will lead from one area of a building to another area of a building. And not all corridors are exit corridors, but they could lead to an area that is an exit area.
Okay. All right. Very good.
If you want to email me, I will look it up in the various codes and provide a precise definition of that. But
Okay. And why don't you give them your email address, Richard?
Sure. It's richard.roberts, R-O-B-E-R-T-S, at systemsensor.com, and that is SYSTEMSENSOR.com.
Gotcha. Thank you. So a question about humidity levels. If humidity levels exceed the UL listing for smoke detectors in, say, a laundry room, are heat detectors permitted?
Good question. I don't know if the code specifically addresses that, but certainly having some form of protection in there would be good. Just keep in mind that heat detectors are not considered life safety devices, so you may want to have a heat detector installed in that room and then a smoke detector just outside the room.
Okay, all right, very good. Attendee has a question on the CO2 area. So he's saying, is 100 pounds CO2 limit per tank? Let me form that in a form of a question. Is the 100-pound CO2 limit per tank or per total in room? I think that's what he's asking.
That I don't know, but I would assume that it would be total,
Okay.
all combined tanks.
Okay,
but
very good.
Again, that's why I said at the beginning of the webinar to, purchase a copy of the actual ICC or NFPA codes, or better yet, the handbook, and that has all the the details and the requirements.
Yep. Another question about voice EVAC here. He's working on a school with 250 students, and they plan to replace the fire alarm control panel. Is it also a requirement to change it to be a voice EVAC functionality?
As I said, the requirements in Section 907.2 of the IFC IBC do not apply retroactively. However, you may want to consult with the local AHJ or the school board to see if they want to further upgrade the system for EVACs, because having a voice system, as I mentioned, has numerous benefits over just having an audible tone throughout the school.
Okay.
And that was the reason why it was added,
Yep, we have time for one more here, so let me serve this one up. For CO detection in the 2015 IFC IBC in K through 12, so they're asking about that portion. Is there a minimum occupancy load, or is it all the K through 12?
Question off the top of my head. No, it's CO detection where the school has a permanently installed fuel burning appliance or an attached garage. And I do not believe that there's any requirement in there in terms of occupant load.
Okay, very good. We are at the top of the hour, and we promise to end our broadcast at that point, and just respecting your time, so we do appreciate your attendance today. On behalf of System Sensor, I want to thank you for joining us. As a follow-up, we will send you a brief survey in about an hour, and would appreciate your help in filling that out. We will also be sending you an archive of the webinar, and then in a separate email, we will send you your certificate of attendance if you joined us today. So thank you for joining us. This concludes our webinar. Please have a nice rest of the day.